It all started with a letter. I remember the morning clearly. The sun had barely risen. The air still cool with that crisp freshness that only comes before the world fully wakes up. I walked out to my mailbox with a steaming cup of coffee in my hand, half thinking about what the day held and half wondering if my hens had already laid their eggs. We didn't have many, just 6 hens, Rhode Island Reds, and a couple of Buff Orpingtons. They weren't just livestock to us. They were part of the family. My kids fed them, cleaned the coop, and learned responsibility from caring for them. Those chickens gave us eggs, laughter, and a sense of peace in our small suburban backyard. But the peace ended the moment I pulled out that envelope. It was stamped with the seal of our Homeowners Association. You know the kind of letter I'm talking about, thick paper, rigid font. A tone so unnecessarily official you'd think it came from a federal court. Instead of a group of neighbors who appointed themselves rulers of the block. I tore it open, expecting maybe a reminder about lawn care or some trivial notice about trash bins. But instead, I found words that made my stomach tighten. Cease and desist keeping chickens on your property. Failure to comply will result in fines, legal action, and possible foreclosure. Foreclosure over chickens. At first, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. Surely this was some clerical error or a misunderstanding. I wasn't running a farm. There were no roosters crowing at dawn, no messy yard, no smell drifting across the neighborhood. Just a small coop tucked neatly behind the garage, out of sight and out of mind. But the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake at all. This was a threat. And it was deadly serious. That was the day my quiet little suburban life turned into a battle I never saw coming. Because what started as a fight for a few backyard chickens quickly turned into something bigger. Fight for my family, my neighbors, and eventually the whole community. And if there's one thing I can say now, looking back, it's that the HOA picked the wrong guy to mess with. At first, I tried to shrug it off. I mean, how serious could they be? It's just a few hens. Nobody in the neighborhood had ever complained to me, and most of my immediate neighbors actually loved the chickens. Kids would carry over baskets of eggs to Mrs. Taylor next door, and she swore they were the best she'd ever tasted. But 2 days later, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't just a notice, it was a fine. $200 due immediately. If unpaid, additional charges would stack up weekly. That's when I realized this wasn't just a warning. This was a campaign. I called the HOA office. Number listed at the bottom of the letter. After 5 minutes of hold music, a woman with a sharp voice answered. She didn't want to hear about how quiet and clean my coop was, or how much the chickens meant to my family. She cut me off with the same line over and over. The HOA covenants clearly state livestock is prohibited. I asked her where it said chickens were livestock. She paused, then admitted she'd have to check with the board. That was my first clue. They weren't even sure themselves. The following week, board members started showing up at my property. Not to talk, not to reason, but to intimidate. They walked along the side fence, peering into my yard like inspectors. One guy even took pictures of my coop without asking. Then came the threats. If I didn't comply, they said, they'd escalate to legal action. Lawsuits, court dates, and yes, foreclosure. They had the power, they claimed, to take my home away. My wife was nervous. She hated confrontation and wanted to avoid trouble. She asked me if maybe we should just give up, rehome the chickens, and move on with our lives. But every time I looked at my kids gathering eggs or saw the hens scratching happily in the dirt, something inside me hardened. It wasn't about chickens anymore. It was about principle. About the right to decide how we lived in our own backyard. That was when I made a decision. I wasn't going to back down. If the HOA wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. When word got out about the letters, the neighborhood started buzzing. Some people came right up to me to offer support. Others, well, let's just say they made it clear they were on the HOA side. Mrs. Taylor, my elderly neighbor, was furious. She stormed over one evening with a pie in one hand and her walking cane in the other. She told me she had lived through tougher times when people depended on backyard gardens and chickens to get by. "They've lost their minds," she said. "You're doing nothing wrong. Those eggs keep me healthier than the junk they sell at the grocery store." But across the street, the Millers weren't so friendly. Mr. Miller, in particular, had a habit of glaring every time he drove past. One morning, he stopped his car, rolled down the window, and shouted, "Rules are rules. If they let you keep chickens, next thing you know, we'll have goats and pigs running around." Then he sped off like he'd just won some argument. It didn't stop there. Soon, I started hearing whispers that the HOA was holding special meetings about me. Meetings I wasn't invited to. Neighbors who had always waved politely at me suddenly looked the other way. Some were afraid of speaking up because they didn't want to be targeted next. But there was another group, a quiet but growing group, who told me they were sick of the HOA too. They hated the way the board nitpicked every detail of our lives. From what color shutters you could have to how tall your grass could grow. To whether your kids could draw with chalk on the sidewalk, everything was controlled. The chickens, they said, were just the spark. The real issue was freedom. I started having conversations over backyard fences, in driveways, at the local coffee shop. People would lean in and whisper, "Don't give up. We're with you." That support lit a fire in me. It made me realize I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was standing up for everyone who felt trapped by these overreaching rules. But the more support I gained, the more aggressive the HOA became. They doubled the fines. They sent another letter, this one threatening to place a lien on my home. And then, one evening, I noticed a stack of envelopes sitting in my mailbox. Not just addressed to me, but to every household in the neighborhood. Inside was a flyer, a full-page warning about the dangers of backyard chickens. According to them, my hens were a health hazard. They carried disease. They attracted predators. They lowered property values. And if the HOA didn't stop me, they claimed the whole neighborhood would turn into a barnyard. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was war. It didn't take long before the HOA kicked things into high gear. One night, as I was unloading groceries from my truck, my neighbor Rick walked over. Rick wasn't exactly the type to get involved in neighborhood drama, but he leaned in close and said, "Hey, just so you know, they held a closed meeting about you last night. Your name came up a lot." I asked him what was said, and he shook his head. "They're looking for ways to hit you hard. Fines, legal action, even talking to their lawyer about fast-tracking a lien on your property. They want to make an example out of you." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about chickens anymore. The board wanted to crush me. If they could scare me into giving up, they'd remind everyone else in the neighborhood who really held the power. The following week, I got a letter from a law firm. Big, bold letters at the top. Notice of legal action. They weren't bluffing anymore. They claimed I was in violation of community bylaws and had 30 days to remove the chickens or face a lawsuit that could include damages, attorneys, fees, and foreclosure proceedings. My wife read the letter and her face went pale. "We can't fight this," she said softly. "We don't have the money for lawyers." And she was right. We weren't wealthy. We were a normal family, just trying to make a life in a suburban neighborhood. The HOA, on the other hand, had a steady stream of dues from every homeowner on the block. They could drag me into court for months and bleed me dry, but I wasn't ready to give in. I started digging into the HOA bylaws myself. Late nights at the kitchen table, reading page after page of legal jargon. Highlighter in hand, coffee keeping. Me awake. I discovered something interesting. Nowhere in the bylaws did it specifically mention chickens. It said livestock prohibited. But livestock was never defined. I printed that page out and circled the section in bright red ink. See this? I told my wife. They're bluffing. They're relying on intimidation, not clear rules. Meanwhile, the HOA board kept scheming. One of my friends who lived 2 streets over told me he'd overheard board members at a restaurant bragging about how they were going to smoke me out before the next annual meeting. Another neighbor said the president of the HOA had ordered special landscaping inspections for my property, trying to catch me on anything they could find me for. They weren't just fighting my chickens, they were fighting me personally. And I realized something important. If I didn't push back, they were going to bury me, so I made a decision. If they wanted a legal fight, fine, but I wasn't going to fight it alone. I was going to rally the people, and that's when everything started to change. You know, if you had told me a year ago that a couple of backyard chickens would lead me into a courtroom showdown, townwide vote, and eventually a complete change in local law, would have laughed you out of the room. But here I was, standing at the end of a long, exhausting, but strangely inspiring battle. And this final chapter, well, it wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about community, about rights, about refusing to be bullied by people who thought power gave them the right to control everything. And let me tell you, it all came to a head in one unforgettable night. After months of threats, fines, and whispered HOA meetings where they plotted their next move, the town finally agreed to hold an open vote on whether backyard farming including chickens would be legalized in our community. This was the moment we had been fighting for. The HOA had painted me as some reckless neighbor who was destroying property values with a few hens. But when the issue was finally brought into the light, people began to see the truth. The week leading up to the vote was electric. Flyers appeared all over town. Some were against us, protect our neighborhoods, say no to chickens, while others supported us with bright pictures of families smiling beside their coops. My kids helped paint a big sign we hung over our garage. Backyard farms equals community freedom. Neighbors came by daily, some just curious, others ready to join the cause. We organized cookouts where people could taste eggs fresh from our hens, and the difference was undeniable. It wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about healthy food, self-sufficiency, and standing up to an HOA that had gone too far. But make no mistake, the HOA didn't back down quietly. They hired lawyers, lobbyists, even paid for a glossy mailer warning that if chickens were legalized, our town would turn into a rural wasteland of noise, smell, and disease. I couldn't believe the fear-mongering. Chickens. Disease. Meanwhile, half the town's dogs barked all night, and no one was writing them up for being a health hazard. Still, I knew they were scared, and that meant we had a real chance. The night of the town hall, the community center, was packed. I'd never seen so many people crammed into one room. Folding chairs lined the walls. People stood shoulder to shoulder, and the air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another boring council meeting. This was a showdown. I walked in with my wife and kids, my neighbors close behind me, carrying petitions stacked high with signatures. On the other side of the room, the HOA board members sat stiffly in their suits, whispering among themselves, their lawyer perched beside them with a briefcase full of documents. The council chair opened the meeting, and almost immediately, the debate erupted. Supporters of the HOA stood up first, arguing about noise, property values, even the danger of predators if chickens were allowed. One man actually claimed coyotes would start roaming the neighborhood if my hens stayed. I had to bite my tongue not to laugh. Then it was our turn. One by one, neighbors, parents, even local business owners stepped up to the microphone to tell their stories. A single mom explained how backyard eggs helped feed her kids. A retired couple talked about how gardening and chickens gave them purpose in retirement. My own daughter, just 12 years old, stood trembling at the mic, but her voice carried. Clear, our chickens are my friends. They help me learn responsibility, and they've never hurt anyone. The room erupted in applause. And for the first time, I saw the HOA board members shifting uncomfortably. When my turn came, I walked up, unfolded the HOA's threatening letter, and held it high for the whole room to see. This, I said, is what started it all. A threat. A warning that my family would lose our home over chickens. Not because we broke any law, but because a handful of board members thought they could bully us into submission. I paused, letting the silence sink in. But this fight isn't about me anymore. It's about us. It's about whether we want to live in a community where neighbors support each other or one where a private board rules us with fear. Tonight, you get to decide. Not them. You. The room erupted against cheers, applause, people stomping their feet on the floor. And in that moment, I knew we weren't just winning, we had already won in spirit. But before the council could take the vote, something shocking came out. A local journalist who had been quietly digging into the HOA asked to speak. He revealed that 2 of the HOA board members had financial ties to a landscaping company, one that had contracts with multiple HOAs in the region. The more restrictions they could enforce, the more contracts they secured, especially since chicken bans meant more uniform yards that required their expensive maintenance packages. The room gasped. People turned to glare at the board members, who suddenly looked pale under the fluorescent lights. The corruption was out in the open. This wasn't about chickens at all, it was about money, power, and greed. That revelation was the nail in the coffin when the council finally called for the vote. The tension in the room was unbearable. Hands raised, one by one. In favor, yes. Against no, it wasn't even close. The motion passed with an overwhelming majority. Backyard farming was now officially legalized in our town. The cheers that followed shook the walls. People hugged, high-fived, even cried. My kids jumped into my arms, and my wife kissed me with tears in her eyes. It was over. We had won. The HOA members slipped out of the room quietly, faces red, shoulders hunched. Their power had been broken, not just by the vote, but by the community standing together against them. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my hens clucking in the yard, sunlight spilling over the fence. But this time, there was no knot in my stomach, no fear of foreclosure letters or lawsuits. For the first time in months, I felt free, and the town, it changed too. More families started building coops, planting gardens, turning their backyards into something more than just patches of grass. A sense of community blossomed where fear had once reigned. The HOA, they lost members, lost credibility, and eventually lost their stranglehold on the neighborhood. People realized they didn't need to be ruled by fear of fines and threats. They needed to stand together. And as for me, I kept my chickens. I built a bigger coop, added a few more hens, and every morning I gathered fresh eggs with a smile. Knowing they weren't just food for my family, they were a symbol of what we had fought for and won. Looking back, it's funny. I never set out to be some kind of activist. I never planned to take on a homeowners association or to change town law. All I wanted was a few chickens in my backyard. But life has a way of turning small fights into big ones, and sometimes those are the fights that matter most. Because in the end, this wasn't just about chickens. It was about standing up for ourselves when people in power tried to push us down. It was about neighbors finding their voice. It was about proving that no matter how small you feel, your voice can spark a movement. So if you're ever faced with a fight you didn't ask for, if someone tries to bully you into silence, remember this: you don't have to back down. Even the smallest battles can lead to the biggest victories. As for Mile B in my backyard, coffee in hand, listening to my hens cluck happily. Forever grateful that we stood our ground and proved one simple truth. Sometimes it only takes a few chickens to change everything.